Good morning and good afternoon to everyone across the globe. Welcome to this exciting roundtable of quicker, faster, safer, the future of global healthcare supply chains. I'm Ann Hunter Van Kirk, the Senior Biopharmaceutical Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, and I'm joined by a great lineup of panelists today. To learn more about them, please visit their speaker bios on the forum portal. With that, let's jump right into the discussion. Mohammed, maybe you can start us off with our overall question. How are organizations in the healthcare, pharmaceutical, and transportation industries using hard-earned lessons to transform their global supply chains? How do they plan for future globalized health challenges?
Thank you, Anne, and thanks for having me in this conference. It's good to be here. I want to start saying during the beginning of this pandemic, we have seen a big shift in the supply chain, specifically when it came to the medical industry, pharmaceutical. We had shortages in the masks, ventilators, and in medicine as well, where companies had to adapt to the new reality. Ports shutting down, aviation industries being affected, all this created a new sense of how can we actually manage the supply chain if it's all centralized in big regional locations. So the idea of having one location to manufacture and ship across the globe, if it's China or India or any other place, started to change at the beginning of the pandemic. As well, countries actually imposing some restrictions on exporting some of the medical product created a new reality for the pharmaceuticals, at the supply chain itself, where how can we actually change this, where we can still provide the supplies, create a new supply chain that is more maybe regional, more country-based when it comes to getting the medications, the supplies to the globe, to the countries, to the people that needs it. This pandemic in specific, because it is a global pandemic, every single country was affected. It's not like one region can help the other. Everyone was actually running to get these supplies, and pharmaceutical companies, manufacturers trying to get it to the people that needs it, created a new reality. Now, where the future and how this could actually change the way companies look at this, I think it's both between the private sector engagement, the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the medical equipment manufacturers, and also state actors, where maybe new incentives for these companies to manufacture locally, regionally, locally, or locally in specific countries. As this conference, the Qatar Economic Forum, Qatar, for example, is doing the same, was trying to encourage companies to come in, created new incentives, realizing that this is the new reality that we need to face on. Many other countries are doing this. In the US here, we're doing the same, we're maybe giving new incentives. So I think the new reality is going to become more of how can we establish new trade regulations where the companies, the supply chain industries, when it fits into the medical equipment shipping and getting it to the people that needs it, work their agreements and regional contracts where they can provide these supplies in a shorter distances through the new reality of potential global pandemic in the future, so we don't run into the same issue again.
Fantastic. And Patrick and Burton, maybe if you would like to respond to that with your supply chain expertise and add on, what innovations are needed to reduce vulnerabilities, streamline processes, and improve healthcare delivery.
Sure.
Patrick, do you want to start us off?
You want me to start talking? That's fine. So thank you for the question, and I think we all learned a lot through this pandemic. One of my bigger takeaways is the vulnerability of your consistent supply of our raw materials. So I'm in the manufacturing business, and we're trying to get that across the globe. And over time, we went to too many single source situations for various reasons. We have some of our materials that, allow me to say it, are not always economically friendly anymore, but they are crucial to the product making. And you cannot find them in too many places across the globe anymore. So there you are already facing an issue of it's produced only in one area of of the world, in a small area of the world. So try to get your materials then across everywhere in a moment of scarcity. So that was a big challenge. And it makes you think, like, can we consider making these raw materials again somewhere else, or do we need to start looking at alternatives of our formulations? So those are really big questions to which you don't have, easy answers or fast solutions. And then I want to switch, if you allow me, to the regulatory aspect, because even if you then come to a solution, you need to go through a very lengthy regulatory process throughout the globe, which every country has its specifics, or every region has its specifics. And in the pandemic situation that we have faced, for me, this has probably been another hurdle that we have to overcome, where you could argue, does it not make sense to look at a global regulatory solution for a pandemic like we faced here? Now that's a very big, heavy loaded question. I know that too, but that's where I see us struggling right now, because we have product and it's good product. We can't have it supplied everywhere in the world because of regulatory constraints. Okay, so those are a couple of bigger takeaways that I'm seeing right now. And I don't know, Burton, if you share this, or if you have any other insights from where you're sitting.
Absolutely, Patrick. I appreciate that context, and what I'll frame up in my role and perspective is, we've got the upstream manufacturing of the goods and raw materials, and then from my perspective, representing the last mile or last kilometer from an end user standpoint. I think what you and Mohammed both touched on was the notion that whether it was pharmaceuticals or supplies, a lot of the shortages or the stress on the supply chain were what I'll call the lower cost or lower margin items. From the pharmaceutical side, it was a lot of the generics that we were experiencing shortages of. Most hospitals, I want to say 90% or 80% of the pharmaceuticals that are dispensed are in that generic category. The masks, the gowns, the ventilators, those are the low margin products that have kind of been put under a fair bit of stress as we've worked to negotiate the pricing down. And I think on that side of the upstream, I would agree wholeheartedly. I think it's trade relationships, government intervention, revisiting of the regulatory requirements for importing or exporting some of those goods to allow for that trade to open up. From a end user, last kilometer standpoint, what we are seeing, and a number of my peers within the U.S. that I've talked to are also doing, are resiliency is the new, I'll say, buzzword for a lot of healthcare supply chains. There's been this dependency on low unit of measure, just-in-time delivery, whether it's from a pharmaceutical wholesaler or from med-surg distributors. And that is what created a lot of the shortages for many hospitals. So for an operations standpoint, expanding and disintermediating some of that distributor relationships and establishing more direct manufacturer relationships between health systems and manufacturers is one avenue for increasing the resiliency. I know we have the benefit of a warehouse that we leveraged quite efficiently during the pandemic, and see more goods and pharmaceuticals running through that warehouse than previously intended. And then the second, from an innovation standpoint, going back to your question, and Hunter, is the investment in technology to help us get some visibility into that chain of custody and kind of where the raw materials for some of these goods are produced and manufactured, so that we can assess some of our suppliers and whether or not they have a resilient supply chain themselves.
And I'll add to that, Bern, because I think that was really relevant from at least what we saw on the Palantir side, helping, I think, over 100 different organizations in 35 countries dealing with all types of these problems. Was most of these organizations, whether government or commercial, just didn't have the end-to-end visibility to know, from the manufacturer to the distribution to transport logistics to all the way to the last mile to the consumer, how they were going to integrate all this data from separate sources into one place and be able to actually make decisions, make better optimizations on that. I think one particular one that comes to mind is for all the vaccination programs. We were helping with both the US and the UK doing the data integration platform for it. You know, if there's a disruption at any given point and every single seam, every handoff, it's going to delay your entire you know, distribution channel and getting things to the endpoint. So definitely echo that. And I think we're seeing a lot more organizations actually use this time to invest in those types of innovations and data sharing agreements as well.
With that, maybe we'll move on to Dr. Barbo and Raja. Maybe we'll start with Dr. Barbo. Though the world regularly encounters local and regional epidemics, how is this year global insidiousness of COVID affecting healthcare planning for the future?
So, Anne, did you want me to go first, or Dr.
Well, I think, Dr. Barbo, I think you might be, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Yes, we will see more pandemics, and they will come with closer intervals. We know that, and the healthcare knew that, and yet they were totally unprepared for this situation, which was surprising and very problematic. And I mean, healthcare in itself are mature traditional organization and tend to be very conservative. So whatever risk assessments they did, they never accounted for the situation. And it was surprising to see how short the planning span was. And I agree with prior speakers here that we need to change healthcare, the way healthcare plan, and create much more innovative solutions. And I think that maybe the less traditional healthcare providers will be more lucky in the future because they can more innovatively create solutions which old healthcare providers don't have the imagination and the agility to do. And I think that companies representing good technologies here can help with planning, logistics, visibility, and speed. Because, I mean, I was sitting in a hospital, not here in Qatar, but in Sweden as a receiver of all this, and we lacked so many things because we hadn't planned for it. And I think that's the learning we need to bring with us. It was also obvious that when technologies existed, then hospitals and healthcare providers were quite quick in adapting new technologies. Look, for example, video conferences or IT-supported doctor's visits. We've been trying to implement that for 15 years to no avail. Nobody wanted them. And then suddenly when the pandemic came, it only took a couple of months. And now every patient, every doctor wants to use this technology for consultation. So if the technology is there and the support is there, and I think maybe Alice and her company can help out here, we will be able to in a more creative, innovative way, deal with the next pandemic. But we have to plan for it now because we are universal, and it was a tough situation. I also work for one of the major companies producing ventilators. So I was sitting on the other side of the table as well. And we were surprised on how short the planning, the planning time for healthcare providers was. They wanted ventilators tomorrow, and lots of them. And that's not something you can produce in a couple of days. It takes planning, and they just hadn't planned for it. And it continued all through, and still does. So I think we need to use the technologies much, much more than we have, but we also need to support these old, slow-moving organizations to greater agility.
Alice, did you want to add on anything to that, or?
Yeah, I think I wanted to add, not to be too doom and gloom here, is on top of the already struggle on the COVID response, and we'll see this, I think, continue to exacerbate a lot of healthcare industries. For instance, last year, we were helping on the US COVID response, trying to set up a data sharing network just from the hospitals over to the government. And I think one of the things that was even crazier on top of the pandemic was that there was flooding in the Midwest, there were hurricanes hitting Texas, there were wildfires out in California that then even exacerbated on top of it, not only the entire supply chain, but also even the data sharing, because people couldn't get to work, they were without power, there were hospitals without, electricity. So not to be too, raise too much concern here, but I think there's a lot about robustness, a lot about resiliency, as Bern mentioned, and I think there's also a lot about just mutual trust with along your entire supply chain of, we're going to get through this together. What are the ways that we can actually set up some of those partnerships, not even just contractually, but informally as well.
And Raja, maybe if you want to join us, what teachings can we learn from different countries' reactions?
Well, I mean, as pointed out, moving into these kind of innovative technologies is what's really required. And if there's any silver lining to COVID, I think what we're seeing is that, healthcare providers as well as healthcare systems are now looking at fully digitizing. The infrastructure, and my company provides blockchain-based solutions which are connected to IoT sensors as well as just normal sensors. The technology is actually there. The issue that we saw before the pandemic is that most people were very conservative in the healthcare sector. They also were not willing to invest in disruptive kind of technologies, that kind of US mindset, as opposed to the European or Asian mindset that we tend to see sometimes, has really kind of changed now. There are technologies which can give you the privacy and security of data you need. And distributed ledger technology allows the use of private keys to guard your security, because most countries are not willing to allow healthcare data to be spread around internationally, or more importantly, within private companies to profit from. So there is that kind of mindset that can be overcome by using technologies. But where we're seeing the greatest kind of innovation, I mean, data analytics is really quite important, but as is pointed out by Alice, you need the infrastructure to have that data integrity, and that is the promise of some of these new technologies. So, so some of the emerging markets, quite surprisingly, countries like Rwanda and Ghana, as I was talking about earlier, are really kind of leading in this area, where they're using mobile phone technology to ensure that there's data capture and integrity. And nowadays, most things can actually be done just on a mobile phone, including scanning. So we've looked at how do you speed up customs authorizations, even in emerging countries, just by scanning a code on top. We've looked at how you deliver pharmaceuticals in an automated way, from procurement as well as delivery by drones. And the technology is available. I think, one of the really important things is to take on that kind of Nordic US mentality of risk taking, which is, look, not ask why, but ask why not, and invest in new disruptive technologies. The kind of concerns over human rights can be overcome by technology. I mean, we have an app which enter into, say, a restaurant or a shopping mall, because it's blockchain based. You're asked consent to share your vaccination record with the person that's looking at it. So I think it's less about the technology. The technology is there. It's about the experts you choose and their willingness to use new technologies, and standards. That's another point that was made up. We usually comply with the US DSCSA regulations for pharmaceutical tracking. The reason being is because you have to record each transfer in the chain of custody. In the in the EU, we have FMD regulations, and they only track at the beginning and at the end. So you've got this massive data hole in the middle of the process. So I think, global standards on things like labeling, i.e. each packet should be uniquely labeled, will help with data analysis. I think global standards on how you track the chain or transfer in custody would be helpful, because there are differing standards, as it were, although all of this can be covered by technology. So a lot of it is actually mindset rather than the availability of technology to be able to do and respond to critical situations like this pandemic.
And do you anticipate any geographic shifts in the supply chain?
Yes, I mean, in the Western countries, what we're noticing, particularly here, and we're part of a few projects where actually medicines are moving towards personalization, right? So you will, in the future, be prescribed, and we're involved in a project here in the UK, you will be prescribed a dosage which is specific to you and your biology, etc. And then when your doctor prescribes this particular medicine, it goes to Siemens actually make these machines where they mix up the medicine out to your house. So it's that kind of direct to home care kind of vision. So centralized kind of large warehousing might in the next 10 years be reduced, especially because what the contributors said, you know, if you have a ship that gets stuck in the Suez Canal, that's going to disrupt your supply chain. So all these talks of just-in-time supplies, which are important to prevent shortages and or even over purchasing, I think will go away when you have far more localized production within countries. And this, I think, is also important for the emerging markets, because there's a big debate, as you know, going on about vaccine production locally in African countries. And, you know, with technologies like ours, you can monitor how many vaccines are made, who they're delivered to, and who is vaccinated in a very safe and secure way. And I think that needs to be a big mental shift in terms of the pharmaceutical industry into local production rather than big hubs around the world. Sounds a bit visionary, but I think we're going to see that shift happening in the next 10 years, particularly because of the trade relations politically between countries as well.
Does anyone else want to add in on that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I concur to that. I'm in the contract manufacturing business of the pharmaceuticals, right? So we've been asked a lot of questions on, do you produce locally where we are operating? So it was very important to go back to the, geographical location where a product is made. And I'm not going to go into further details here, but we were lucky due to our large network globally that we could accommodate those requests. And they were really needed to speed up the production of the vaccine. So it has been of help, and it was definitely a deciding factor for the companies that came to us and contracted to work out to us. So I think your point is well taken, Raja.
And if I may, I thought I might chime in on this conversation as well, as far as the shift or diversification from one central point of manufacturing and the diversification that Raja and Patrick were talking about, as far as there being kind of a shift to localized production. There might be a split path, if you will, between the pharmaceutical supply chain and I'll say med-surg supplies. Anecdotally, what we saw during the pandemic on the supply side of that equation was a lot of the manufacturers that have brand names that we've kind of grown to know and trust over the years. A lot of the manufacturing for the masks and other PPE isn't necessarily owned by the manufacturers, but rather contracted out, and a lot of that contracting was heavily localized in China. So what I would say, as far as a shift of manufacturing, is that a number of the suppliers that we've been working with, establishing more direct relationships and assessing some of their resiliency, it seems like a general theme is not a complete migration out of China, but a broader diversification, so that all those subcontracting relationships and manufacturing sites aren't localized because of the impact that had during the pandemic.
And what sort of impact does that have on getting high quality API in countries?
So I think I'll defer to some of the other panelists as it relates to the active pharmaceutical ingredients, because I think that's more of along the localized thread that perhaps Raja was discussing or Patrick was commenting on. From a supply standpoint, it would be less relevant. Raw materials critical, and we've seen some of the raw materials for those supplies migrating as that manufacturing of the finished supply moves as well.
I don't if I wanted to just comment on part of the moving towards the new technologies and innovation and utilization of that. I think one thing that at least at the beginning of the pandemic we witnessed. I mean, at the council, we're dealing with a lot of other companies that exports between medical equipment from the United States to even food products. I think one of the most important factor was there was, first of all, everything was centralized somewhere, but there was a lot of human factor involved. And that human factor during that pandemic was the major factor that you can utilize. The laborers, the people that actually work at the factories, to the people, again, at the ports where they couldn't even do their jobs, to the pilots in aviation where they can actually ship these products somewhere. So I think maybe in the future where we're looking, and I know a lot of these companies that they do that at this point, where how can we actually utilize artificial intelligence, self-driving, trains, trucks in the future, where if it's not centralized, things could be actually in a way automated, where the manufacturing process somewhat less rely less on the human factor again, but that plays a different role. Are we replacing the human factor in manufacturing these products and delivering them? It's the regular medication, the people, the diabetic people that not getting their injections. At some point, they can get an appointment now online. They can get the prescriptions filled, but who's going to deliver it to them? And that became a new thing that we're learning. Where countries, I witnessed, I traveled to the Middle East at the latter part of the pandemic from the U.S., and for the first time, I noticed people actually using the delivery services where it was not that much utilized in many countries in the Middle East. We heard a lot of companies doing that in Europe and in the US, but not as much in the Middle East. But now it becomes a buzzword where they created actually a new word for it in different countries on how to get this delivered. That's something new. And I think that if we go back to the bigger picture, the bigger supply chain, not the smaller part getting to the final, the patient or the person that needs the product, I think companies will have, in my personal opinion, and when it comes to the trade and policies and dealing with states, I think this will give companies, private sector companies, more power when they negotiate with the states on investment laws when it comes to, if you want me to be here, if you don't want to run into this issue in the future, you need to actually modify your rules and regulations where I can actually utilize more technologies. Maybe this will not hire as many people as specific countries want, but this is taking that risk factor out of the equation and minimizing the future. So I don't know how much companies will have more power when they negotiate with the states these days, but we did see this. Companies dealing with the FDA in the United States, with the emergency authorizations, these things that happen so fast in many levels, not just on the vaccine, it's something new, and I think it will become somewhat permanent, not 100% permanent, but will become permanent when it comes to we need to eliminate many of the risk factors that we've witnessed this year and potentially in many, many other pandemics in the future.
Ravish, maybe do you want to join in here on some of the greatest challenges that the supply chain is facing?
Yes, thank you, Anne. So listening to the colleagues, what they're talking about, I think the key question here is, what are these challenges that we're facing for and what are we needing to solve for from a supply chain perspective. And listening to this conversation, we're looking at agility being one of the key areas in supply chain that needs to be resolved for. And if you look at the conversation around supply chain and being in the supply chain industry some time ago, the challenges that this industry is facing is no different to the FMCG industry or any other industry, where the mindset is a bit silent. Looking at internally focused mindset between planning, sourcing, manufacturing, and delivery. And the conversation needs to change. And as Raja said, technology can be the enabler in this. And one of the key focuses that we need to look at into the future is, listening to this conversation, I never heard anyone talk about patient centricity. Now, the conversation in supply chain is what are we bringing these products to market for? Is the patient. And the conversation needs to change and start to look at things from a patient centricity perspective. Look, legislation is going to be there. These things are going to be there all the time. And this is a big elephant that we need to carve and, start to look at. And when we start to focus at these things, especially when we start to partner with the business, we start to partner with the business with two mindsets. The business of today mindset is what is the business of today doing? And what is the business of the tomorrow needs to be in supply chain itself? So when you start to look at this partnership and this integration and moving away from the siloed approach, it becomes a total value chain. And to Raja's point is the concept of the blockchain becomes very, very important in how you maneuver the blockchain through this entire supply chain of global healthcare. And global healthcare is not a supply chain that is a supply chain where you can have a standardization in it, because you have different products in it. You have the medical device products, and you have pharmaceuticals. You have the difference. It comes back to saying, what is your business plan and what is your value proposition to reinvent the supply chains? Because the key conversation here is the reinvention. Because planning and execution and is very, very important. The plan, source, make, and deliver. But the focus here is saying that digital platform that needs to be brought into the forefront does not give a competitive advantage to any one of the people in the supply chain, but adds the value from a customer centricity perspective based on a blockchain, becomes an important conversation of where you interact with the people, process, technology, data, and information based on legislation.
Can I just raise a couple of points on what Ravesh said, if that's okay? And the concept of the blockchain is important because it allows co-opetition, right? You can have one platform where competitors can work together, and you have private keys. I mean, I don't want to get into the technicals, but like you can guard your data and you can ensure it's only disclosed to the parties you want it to disclose. So, a regulator, for example, the FDA, EMA or MHRA case here in the UK, they can have different data access rights to your partners, such as a DHL, et cetera, et cetera. So the other important thing is it does work with legacy infrastructure. You can ingest from others. So for Western countries, which already have infrastructure, it does allow advantages over there. But we have to be very clear about this. Pharmaceutical industry is very different to industries, right? And we've seen this. When there are issues, you get nationalism coming out. We had it here in the UK. We didn't want to start exporting the AZ vaccines and the Pfizer vaccine. In India, you had the issue with the Serum Institute, and India suffered really badly even through the second wave. So you need government regulation which is reasonably uniform, that allows everyone to benefit. And blockchain does actually help participants or stakeholders on the platform because it reduces their overall costs generally, because they have one platform, that they have this co-opetition ability. And it also allows regulators, coming to Mohammed's point, it allows customs officers to clear customs very quickly because they can rely on the certificates that are provided by the originating destination. So you don't get fake PPE, you don't get fake masks, or more importantly, you don't get fake medicines infiltrating the supply chain. So the customs officers can wave it through. The regulator can demand forecast for the future, because when your population isn't getting medicines and isn't being cured, it's going to be a very disruptive society, and it's going to be a free-for-all. So you do need to have, the ability to be able to ensure you've got medicines available to take care of the health of your nation. Otherwise, it's not just unrest, your country's at peril. So technologies, I think, are important. I think it's which technologies you use in this kind of environment, and why are you not using them? It's that whole Jeff Bezos mentality I come back to, which is stop asking why should I use IoT? Why should I use blockchain? Ask yourself, why not? And if I was, a national minister of health right now, I'd be saying, okay, I have nothing right now. Should I be using 3G or should I be using 5G? Well, actually, you should be talking about 6G right now, because that's coming in 2 years. And he shouldn't be talking about cloud infrastructure. He should be talking about nodes and which distributed ledger platform he should be using.
Dr. Barbo, did you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, I listened to this conversation. It's highly interesting, and we cover a lot of different levels, everything from national levels, international levels, to the level where I am running hospitals currently now in Doha. And we talk about the past tense. It's not the past tense. We're still suffering from lack of material, pharmaceuticals, consumables, because it's not over. And that's partly due to all these levels that we've been discussing, but also partly, and I come back to that, to the poor planning capacity or capability of most healthcare providers. That's not what we do, and we're not good at it. So we need help from all these actors, the companies, the producers of these, the materials that we need. And I think that the companies that could help us do that in a efficient and visible and logistically agile way will be the winners, at least in the near future, because this is badly needed. Hospitals are old-fashioned organizations. We're slow-moving. And I think the only ones we can learn from are the developing countries that jump a lot of steps and go straight to the cell phone delivery and whatever imaginative ways you can get. But please remember, we're not done yet. We're in the middle of it, and we're still lacking both pharmaceuticals and consumables and equipment. They're hard to get.
Burton,
if I could, yeah, thank you. I was going to chime in on both Dr. Frieden's as well as Raja's comments. Raja, I think you asked why, we've got the technology, we've got the solutions, why aren't we using it? And I think it goes back to Ravesh's comment around knowing the customer and perhaps a patient-centric view.
Exactly.
Anecdotally, before stepping into my current role at Johns Hopkins Health System, I had the benefit of consulting and seeing a lot of different health systems and hospitals across the U.S. and what their supply chains looked like. And typically, supply chain was in the basement of a hospital, down the hall from the morgue. And it wasn't really included in many of the strategic conversations that were occurring in the hospital. I jumped at the opportunity of my current role because I'm privileged to be in an organization that views and has elevated its supply chain and considers it a strategic partner. But I think on the other side, or as we shift into a different phase of the pandemic, to echo Dr. Frieden's sentiment, I'm hoping or anticipating there being a bit of a renaissance where there is more dialogue and an awakening around the critical role that supply chain plays in supporting that delivery of care to patients. And with that will come a need to reinvest in resources that are spanning talent, skills, capabilities, bringing in supply planning as a core competency to healthcare supply chains, where historically that has not been the case, and being able to integrate and pull in some of these technology solutions that are going to be game changing and have a potential for high impact when we think about resiliency and being able to continue to deliver critical patient care and not be subject to the frequency of shortages and back orders for critical pharmaceuticals and supplies. But so I wanted to throw that out there because it seems in some of the conversations I'm having with my peers that a lot of that is underway. But I think that might be what's perhaps slowing what should be an accelerated pace of adapting technology.
What if we could give a 3D printer to every patient so they can print their own medication at home? Would that be nice?
Yeah.
So, I mean, coming to Barbara's point, and Bert, to a certain extent, there are companies there that can help you. Doctors are focused on the patient, as you said. They're not focused on technology. What they do want, however, is technology that's easy to use. Now, we also work in the cell and gene therapy sector, which is, the CAR T treatments and gene therapies like Zolgensma, which are very expensive, $500,000. And we had to work with, I won't say which systems, but we've worked with other hospital systems because, of course, in the UK, as part of the NHS, we have to be interoperable with existing systems. What we were quite shocked by was the kind of feature rich techie kind of views, right? We make a very kind of strong principle that we will use social media type of UX or UI to make it easier for the nurses and the doctors to A, get the information they need, and B, to be able to order the services. And that is all about improving the patient experience. The patient wants to know, am I going to get my treatment on the day you call me in? I don't want to wait for 3 hours, right? The doctor wants to know, can I use the technology to be able to reschedule my patients as quickly and easily as I want? And can I get the records about that patient that I need for that particular appointment, right? So there is a lot of thought into it. I do believe countries like Qatar, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, they have the ability and the kind of centralization because of the population size to be able to really jump forward over and above the current legacy systems we're using here in the West. It comes back to the Rwanda thing. Why use copper wires when you can use 5G, right? And it's a similar way in the healthcare sector. But again, Barbara, it's all down to who the experts you choose is. If you get an expert who comes in with the mentality of nobody ever got fired for choosing IBM, then you've chosen the wrong guy, because it may be comfortable and you're not going to get fired even though you're paying 20 times or 100 times more than you need to. But what you do need to ask is, why is it I'm not using these innovative startups that have got some amazing kind of technology out there to make your life easier? To the point, I'll give you an example. We use things like Fitbits and smartwatches to monitor a patient's vital sign from their home. They don't need to be in the hospital. And we know in the COVID situation, you want to empty out those hospitals as much as possible. But again, to convince a hospital administrator that, look, the technology is available there, the question is, well, we're managing. Well, you're not, because your A&E rooms are packed out.
If I just say on what Rogers was saying and everyone else, and I think one part that we're getting to is that where is the infrastructure in many places that actually will support that? So are we investing enough in infrastructure? And it's very interesting to see some emerging markets, Qatar, many other nations in the GCC and surrounding regions have more stable infrastructure when it comes to digital access to actual delivery infrastructure than we have in the United States. So are we investing enough in infrastructure that will support the new way of delivery? from the actual digitization of the records or the supply chain to the delivery, getting the actual products. Are we going to change the rules and laws to allow drone delivery at some point where we don't have that human factor? I think these a lot of investments questions that countries needs to do.
I hate to cut us off, but we are unfortunately out of time. This was a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for your time today, and I look forward to continuing it soon.
Thank you so much.